everyone. Thanks so much for your patience there. Sorry about that hold in the waiting room for a couple seconds. We want to thank you all for joining us today for our public service session. Before I do hand the mic off, I do want to just give a couple quick reminders. If you can have your microphone on mute throughout, just to avoid any disruptions, we'd appreciate it. But please feel free to use the chat box to communicate throughout Jack's talk. Instead of using a PowerPoint presentation today, it will be more so of an informal conversation with Jack about his 50 years of experience working on poverty-related issues. And we would like to engage with you all as much as possible, so we do welcome you to have your cameras on throughout this session. We will open up Q&A at the end, and you can either use the chat to communicate your questions, or feel free to use the raise your hand feature, and I can call on those with their hands raised to unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. Last thing to note is the session is being recorded. All right, well, before we get started, does anyone have any announcements or anything they'd like to give the group? If so, feel free to just unmute yourself and okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our director of the Meters Partnership for Progress, Ms. Syllabit, and she will introduce our speaker, Jack Frech.
Thanks, Mackenzie. And you can blame me for the delay in getting in today. My audio sometimes doesn't work, so my sincere apologies. But it's really my pleasure. I serve as the Director of External Relations for the Voinovich School, and I also have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director for the Mayor's Partnership for Progress. That is a group of mayors and city managers in 18 counties in Southeast Ohio, and we have worked with them for 25 years now. So it's really a lot of fun, and it's been quite challenging this year. Jack, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that, but I have the pleasure of introducing Jack, and I have not had the pleasure of working with him prior to this work with the Mayor's Partnership, and it's really been a delight. Prior to his retirement, he worked for Athens County Jobs and Family Services for 33 years, and he is really notorious for being the go-to person for advocacy for the poor and underserved in our region, and we just couldn't thank him enough for everything that he's done for the region. And he's notorious, right, for bringing Athens County Jobs and Family Services out of a $200,000 deficit to over $1 million in cash. So he must know something about what he's doing in management there in this arena. But now he has the pleasure of working with the mayors and the city managers and me, and he really supports us with advocacy work and research and technical assistance. And if you want to get something in the paper, you go to Jack, because he's going to probably bang on someone's door to get into a paper. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Jack, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today.
Thank you. First of all, I do want to thank Amista for those kind words. And I also want to thank Mackenzie for all her hard work in putting this together. And not just now, but all of these sessions she's put together. It's just been really a great series of discussions, and she does a good job. As I look around the names, the folks who are working on this, I also have to just say thanks to all of you for your public service, and for all the hard work that you have done, and for those of you who are students, for the things that you certainly will do. You know, I think that having the opportunity to work in public service is an honor and a privilege, and I don't think we thank each other nearly enough for the hard work we all do. And so I want to make sure you all know that I definitely appreciate all the hard work you guys do to help everyone in the public. I'm going to jump right to the punchline. For those of you who have to drop off earlier or not off or whatever, eat lunch, the answer to poverty is sharing. The answer to poverty is always going to be sharing. People and institutions that have enough or more than they need to share with those who don't have enough. And that's seems very simplistic, but it's really at the heart of the solution to sharing or to poverty. And I think much of what we'll talk about in the way of public policy really comes down to all the reasons we have for why we don't want to share with other people. And when I say share, I don't mean just write them a check or donate a can to them. I mean public policies about minimum wage, about housing assistance, about public transportation, public health. All of those things are systems whereby we share as a community with other people. And of course, there are system of taxation. Some people contribute more because they can, and others less. But it's really a system of sharing. And it's through that system that we can address this problem of poverty. But what the major lesson I have learned over these 50 years has been that we look for almost any reason we can find not to do that. So one of the things I'd like to have you kind of think about as we go through this discussion is, what are we so afraid of? I mean, why are we afraid? Why are we more afraid of some single mother with kids getting an extra $100 a month that we somehow think she doesn't deserve? We're more afraid of that happening than we are of her having no money at all and sleeping in the car with her children with no food. Because that's the circumstances we actually have in this country right now. And yet most of our public policy tends to be focused on making sure she doesn't get an extra $100 or so. So that's kind of the bottom line in the Cliff Notes version of what I'll be talking about today. The other thing is that the truth of the matter is that our communities have pretty much in many areas just divided off economically, so that most people who are not poor have very little contact with people who are. People have moved out to the suburbs, and even in small communities, people tend to push poor people off into other areas and out in the county here or in the cities and inner city areas, and they really have very little contact with them personally. At least not as much as they're aware of. In fact, they probably, if they go to a store anywhere, the clerk that's taking care of them may very well be poor. If they have parents in a nursing home, probably the people cleaning up after them are probably poor. There's lots of poor people around, but they tend to be invisible to us, and we don't tend to engage with them about their issues when we do come in contact with them. So in these circumstances, it's really become even easier in some ways to perpetuate the big lie. Big lie is a great term right now. Everyone's using this in reference to the election, and how easy it's become for people to, and we're always baffled by this. How can millions of people believe, this big lie about what happened with the election? Similarly, people are, baffled about how can we believe this big lie about climate change? Well, we've been believing big lies about racial issues, about sexism issues, about discrimination forever. The big lie about poverty essentially is that somehow if we give people money, it's going to hurt them. That somehow it'll hurt their character. That they don't really want to work. That they are lazy. That they are dishonest. Many of the same kind of lies that we've told about African Americans and other minorities, and just about anybody we don't like, we have applied to low-income people, to poor people. I can tell you from my experience that these are big lies. I can tell you that what I think breaks my heart the most when we start talking about these issues and people constantly coming back to me about how, if we give someone a few more bucks or if we give them too much money, they won't want to work. What I think is so offensive about that is that there's no means test on people loving their kids or their family members. And the reason I know, my experience in working with thousands of poor people over the years, they do want to work because they want their kids to have the same thing we all want our kids to have. They want to have safe environments for them. They want them to have an education. They want them to have good things. And that, they are very motivated to want to work. Of course, the the real evidence of that in the end is that most poor people already do work. If they're able to work, they're already working. It's just that the jobs don't necessarily pay enough. And yet we still continue with our public assistance policies, presuming that folks are dishonest, folks are don't want to work. So I actually had a quote I wanted to read to you that was from Frederick Douglass. He said that when men oppress other fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression, which means that, this has been true what we've done in racial issues. Clearly folks, African Americans worked harder than anybody back during the slavery days, and yet as soon as we ended slavery, right away we decided that they were lazy. We've done this same kind of thing with poor people who we know work in the hardest jobs, the most underpaid jobs, the most difficult jobs out there. And yet somehow when they don't have a job, now all of a sudden we think they're lazy. So I think, in the same way that racism, which is very much, a big part of poverty, any other prejudice like that, I think we spend an awful lot of time studying poor people, trying to figure out how to change their behavior, and far, far less time looking at ourselves saying, maybe the problem is us. Maybe it's not really them. I mean, I think the other thing that we do is we tend to put poor people in a situation where they end up having very few good choices. In other words, I think of a single mom or a young family that they can't afford car insurance. And as a result, they lose their driver's license. And yet, if they want to work, in fact, if they're on welfare, they're told they have to work. And if they go out and drive to go to work, now they've broken a law. Now they've committed a crime. We put poor people in this situation constantly. So we put them in these terrible, terrible situations. We wait for them to make a bad choice. And then we say, look, this just confirms what we said all along. It's about character. It's their character that's the problem. So this is you'll find out pretty soon why I almost never get invited back to speak anywhere. It's like one and done. It's just the way it is, folks. I'll give you a little brief history for me about how I ended up being so crazy about all this stuff. When I was young, very young, in fact, I was 4 years old. I had three brothers, and when my mother was pregnant with my younger brother, she clearly couldn't wait to get me out of the house, so she sent me to kindergarten when I was only 4, and my birthday wasn't like till November. So I was young in school. But then on top of that, I lived in a house. My house that I lived in was literally attached to a grocery store that my grandparents ran. So when I would get home from kindergarten, again, my mother, with all these boys, couldn't, any reason to get rid of us was good. She would send me over to the grocery store. And at the grocery store, my grandmother would teach me to count by having me count the bread delivered by the Schwabel's bread man every afternoon. So every afternoon I would be there learning how to count the Schwabel's bread man, and I started working at the store. From that, me and my brothers started learning how to stock the shelves down on the lower levels, just the ones we could reach, because again, I from that time, I worked in the store every day. And right on through school, every after school, we would come home and work in the grocery store. But the lessons that I learned there had to do with the competition between these little corner grocery stores back in these days, in the 50s. They were all over the place. So in order literally for your family to make it, you had to make sure that you did better service than the customers, than the other grocery store 2 or 3 blocks away. Hardly anyone went to big grocery stores there. So it was kind of drilled in my head from that young of an age that your job was to take care of the person standing in front of you, the customer, that you needed to be polite, considerate. You need to do whatever they wanted. You need to ask them what they needed. You need to strike up a conversation with them that was about them, that you needed to take care of them, because essentially in so doing, you were taking care of yourself and the community. Taking care of the person standing in front of you was the way to secure your own security, as well as the community. So that was kind of what was drilled into my head from a very young age. It was obviously learned responsibility, having a job from that point on. But it was this whole idea of, you were not into yourself, you were into the person standing on the other side. Well, that became such a part for me that, I kind of carried that with me in everything else I did later on. Of course, the other thing that I had, my grandmother who ran this grocery store also we had a lot of poor people on our side of town. She offered them credit long before the food stamp programs. The poor families on our side of town could come to our grocery store and she would give them credit. She would help them out during lean times when they were laid off. She was kind of like the little mini welfare department there. Because I also learned that, these folks may be down now, but they're customers. When they get a job, you want them to come back to your store. You want to take care of them. Their well-being is your well-being. So all that kind of stuff was really drilled into my head day in and day out, literally until, when I was 17 and went off to Ohio University. It took me years and years to finally end a conversation with people where I didn't say, thank you, please come again. It was just, kind of automatic. So I bring that up because, again, those were things that then as I, got to be an employee at other places, got to be a caseworker, social worker, CAP agency, all those things. I always had that kind of sense of taking care of these other folks. The other thing that was that I couldn't have known was that back in 1973, when I became a welfare caseworker, I'd had a job, or a degree from OU in secondary education. I'd done my student teaching up in Cleveland on the east side at predominantly African-American school, Cleveland JFK, and lived in the community up there. Nevertheless, I had a very hard time finding a teaching job. I took a civil service test, got hired as a welfare caseworker. What I didn't understand then was that in 1973, that would be the high point in our years, or my time in the system for our treatment of poor people. The amount of money we gave people in cash assistance and welfare when I started, which, by the way, at that time there was only a 3 or 4 page application, would literally bring families almost up to the poverty level. Most families at that time, because manufacturing jobs were still very strong, most jobs that you could get would pay you a living wage. Literally, most of the minimum wage jobs at that time were often taken by second and third wage earners in houses. Most families had a place to live. Almost everybody had an old junk car they could keep on the road. It was tough. They still had a very, very hard time. But I didn't realize that it was going to go all downhill from there. Today, the amount of cash assistance that we give people, and combined with food stamps, literally only brings them to half the poverty level. In fact, in Ohio, if your income with kids, if you're above 50% of the poverty level, you're not even eligible to get cash assistance. Clearly, over all that time, most people now are no longer able to keep a car on the road. We have much, much greater societal problems with homelessness, hunger. There were very few soup kitchens or food pantries back then. Very, very few. Most counties had no homeless shelters. Things that we kind of take for granted now that are part of our system because the safety net programs that we had designed to feed people, put a roof over their head, and provide them with care they need are worse off now than they were 40 years ago. I know people find that hard to believe, but that's true. I think the other thing that I find is in my lifetime, like I'm 70 years old. I know you're shocked. You think, no way. I know that. I can see your reactions. It's like, that can't be. When I was a kid, Jim Crow laws were the law in the South of Ohio and of America. I mean, they were in effect. There wouldn't be significant civil rights legislation until I was a teenager. I watched the TV shows with the little kids getting fire hoses turned on them and dogs and all those terrible things. That all was going on in my lifetime. And I know for a lot of folks, we went through the Kennedy thing, all this stuff, Civil Rights Act, all that. We really, really imagined that somehow that was all going to go away. It was so horrific and so awful that the whole racism issue, now that our eyes have been opened, we're going to take care of that. There was a similar, I think, inspiration for us then later in the 60s when Lyndon Johnson came along with the war on poverty. It's like, this is very early in my life. I see, a government that is committed to ending racism. I see a government that's committed to ending poverty, and presidents and people who talk about those things and make that their priority. Little would I guess that so many years later, decades later, we would still have very, very many of the very same struggles. In spite of the fact that we have had gains in some areas, for sure, absolutely, we still have the same kind of struggles going on. And I think that, when I never would have guessed at this age, I would see people carrying the Confederate flag through the capital of America. So that's kind of on the downside of how bad things are getting. But I also, on the plus side, on the glass half full side, I also never imagined that we'd be writing a check for a couple $1,000s to everyone else in America. So there is an equal amount of hope in some ways. I think that built into the welfare system is this presumption, as I said, about poor people being dishonest. I can tell you that we had incredibly detailed means testing processes that include, we did computer matching against every database you can imagine for unemployment, Social Security, all kind of other assistance like that. We also did data matching against bank records, savings accounts. There was a new hiring process that we did that everyone who hires folks above a certain level in the state has to report the new hires to the state of Ohio. They have a database of that. We check poor people against all of those things now and have been. We have right now, the fraud rate on like food stamps and cash assistance, the error rate is like 6 or 7%. The fraud rate is like 3%, because half of the errors that are made are agency errors, because we've made the application, the welfare process, so complicated that we can't even do it ourselves. 20 years ago, our agency did a little survey, and we put someone through the system. We kept track of the number of questions that we asked people to get on public assistance. This is for cash and food stamps. 700 questions. 700 questions. We looked at the rules that we were applying to them. There were about 1,400 pages of rules that applied to these people, just so that we could give them, and again, we had these computer matches, also that we could give them $300 a month. I always said it would be easier to give someone a national security clearance than to get someone on cash assistance. It's in spite of that, in spite of all of that, And then in spite, of course, welfare reform coming along 20 years ago and imposing a work requirement on all these folks. In spite of all that, we still are cutting people off public assistance. We still have reduced the benefits. We still are acting as though these people are even still criminals, still not deserving. Because that's essentially what we have done, is we've created in our minds this whole idea that we can only help people who are deserving. And the standard of who is deserving, they never seem to actually get there, even when they do everything we ask them to do. So that's part of the challenge. I think part of the other challenge, though, for all of us is trying to imagine helping people that we don't like, that we don't like. We don't like what they're doing. When in my role, in the welfare department, this is one of the challenges I always had, even with my own staff. And I will tell you that we hired poor people into our office. I mean, in order for me to make sure there were always poor people around, and then I always had contact with them, more than half the people who worked in our staff were former recipients. We offered direct services right out of our office to make sure that there were always poor people there. We used them when they had to do a work assignment. We had 20 or 30 of them working in our office all the time. I thought it was critical that we always have personal contact with folks. So, I think that makes sure that those of us in the system realize that these are all human beings. They all need our help. But it's still this challenge about, helping people that you don't think are worthy. I'll give you two examples of things that happened to me back in I'd say this was right around the time of welfare reform in the mid-90s. I was sitting in my office out of the county home, and my office at that time was right downstairs close to the front door. And one day I get this call that's one of the community work experience workers had passed out and was laying on the floor in this other room. So I rush over there. Of course, she's passed out in there. We call the squad. We finally get her to come back around. And what we find is that she passed out because she hadn't had any food for a couple of days. And the reason she didn't have food for a couple of days, and she was very young, she had a very young husband who was also maybe 19 years old. But her husband and his best friend had essentially been abusing her continuously and taking their cash assistance and spending on whatever, but not allowing her to have any food to eat. And she passed out. So, we end up getting the cops involved, all that kind of stuff happens. Literally within 2 or 3 days after that, I'm again sitting in my office and I hear this noise, this person coming down the steps from upstairs, spewing profanities at a very loud volume. And I go out and I see this woman coming down the steps, very, very, very tall, very large woman, just screaming obscenities left and right, coming down the steps, and she's got on a tank top and this jacket with the sleeves taken off. And so I kind of stop for a minute to engage her, and I see that on her arm, she's got handwritten tattoos that basically describe, her favorite sex acts. I mean, they are like blatantly visible. And she's just really upset and cusses me out, storms out the door. So what's the lesson I learned from this? The lesson I learned from this within a day or so, it struck me. It was my job to take care of those two people, those two guys who abused their wife and their friend. It was my job to take care of this woman. What I come to find out about her was that the reason she was in the office is that she'd had her 4-year-old daughter taken away from her, and she had to get a job and had to become stabilized so that she could get her daughter back. And that, of course, this woman who had been abused was right back with those same people. But I also, this was a huge wake-up call for me that there are no disposable people. No disposable people. Everybody who is here They all need a roof over their head. They all need shelter. They all need food. They all need all their basic needs met, even if that means, those are the kind of their behavior is nothing that we really like. But they're still here and they still need that care, because the truth of the matter is we can't do rehab on folks. We can't educate people. We can't provide them with counseling. We can't do any of those things and expect them to succeed for somebody who has no food, for someone who doesn't have a roof over their head. I mean, the truth of the matter is that in this country, these two guys who went off to jail were guaranteed to have health care, were guaranteed to have food, were guaranteed to have a roof over their head while they were in jail. They were not guaranteed that any more than this other woman was the minute she got out, and essentially was, back out in the wild. So I think that's a tough lesson, and it's tough for us to imagine. We start thinking about why do we have poverty. I guarantee you there are lots of people, including lots of people on this call, who can think, no, I just don't want to help those kind of people. Somehow I feel like I'm contributing to their issues. So there's it's easy when I look at this stuff at times to get depressed about it. But the truth of the matter is that over my career, that we have had the opportunity to send literally thousands of people back to school who needed an education. We helped thousands of people, keep their homes, get food they wouldn't have had otherwise, get health care. I think healthcare is one of the areas where we have shown an expansion of the Medicaid program over the years that are actually helping more people than we did back then. I think, we have made huge gains in many of the support systems that we have out there for helping poor people navigate these systems. I think that's it's kind of a mixed bag. Because what's also happened, and I'll give you the example of this is with the welfare block grant. We've created this kind of human service infrastructure, counseling, education, case management, all those kind of things, all of which are very helpful to families who are struggling, who need someone to help navigate through these systems. At the same time, because of things like the welfare block grant, we've created kind of this poverty industrial complex that's actually competing with those same families for the same money. And I'll use the welfare block grant as an example. The welfare block grant was $17 billion when it was passed 25 years ago, TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. At that time, about 80% of that money or more went directly to the families in the way of welfare payments. And at that time, most families who were born on welfare were on welfare and getting assistance. But since we enacted that block grant, the states have been, instead of being more generous when they had all this flexibility, were in fact much more stringently stingy. So now in Ohio, for instance, only about 25% of that money actually goes to help families on assistance. The average payment for a family on assistance per person is about $200 a month. You get about $180 a month in food stamps per person. Much more of that money now has been diverted into daycare, administrative costs, other programs that fund staff to deal with poverty and poor people. You'll note in the last few years, the welfare block grant in Ohio, like I said, right now, I think we're only spending maybe $200 or $300 million a year on direct cash assistance. We just funded about $600 million a year to the schools to do student wellness activities with these same poor kids. Every dime of which is necessary out there because these kids are hurting so bad and they need so much help in getting through school. But we were much more willing in some ways to provide money to other people to help poor people, to help change their behavior, to guide them, than we are willing to actually give money directly to poor people. You're going to see amount of money even larger than that that's soon going to come down through the Medicaid system because of this whole issue of social determinants of poverty. And as a result, all the managed care companies now are expected to address those issues which are all pretty much basically just about poor people and things they don't have. So all of them are now setting up their own case management systems, their own kind of mini welfare departments, their own process, because they also need to do that. The reason schools and healthcare providers are getting these resources is because we have so deprived poor people of money that now it shows up in the education of the kids. It's so much harder to educate kids who don't have their basic needs met. It shows up in health outcomes on Medicaid. People are, no matter how much money we pour into healthcare, if they don't have enough to eat and a roof over their head, they're still getting sick. Their health outcomes are still bad. All of these things disproportionately are hurting African Americans and minorities because racism is still so strong that these folks still are struggling to have jobs and still struggling to meet their basic needs in the regular economy. And this is true for women as well. So I want to leave some time for discussion on this, but I also want to, before we do that, I want to mention a quote from Winston Churchill. That's one of my favorites. He said, "America can always be counted on to do the right thing, but only after we've exhausted all other possibilities." Sometimes I think that's kind of what happens. Is, we have to stumble, we have to fall back sometimes. But I think, we make progress. And I think, right now we are in a position where we're literally writing checks to everybody. We're expanding food stamps. We're expanding assistance for people for water. We're expanding, programs out there because, now in this pandemic, we see that this helps the whole community. Truth of the matter is those things always will help the whole community. So that's what I kind of ask people to think about too, is like, what are we so afraid of? I mean, we're doing this now. Are we afraid that if we really help these folks out, again, I'll mention the TANF block grant was $17 billion 25 years ago. It's still $17 billion now. We're spending trillions of dollars now to bail things out, trillions. The last economic collapse, we spent $700 million to bail out Wall Street. The amount of money we provide for cash assistance is $17 billion. The amount we spend on food stamps is probably 80 or billion or so. SSI, I think, is maybe 60 billion or something like that. They sound like big numbers until we find out in times like this what big numbers really are. Truth of the matter is we can solve poverty anytime we want to in this country. So I guess my question is, why are we so afraid to do that? And with that, I will see if people have some comments or questions or whatever.
Thank you so much, Jack. We do already have a question in the chat from Ani. He has asked, why has the country failed Appalachia? If you look at the statistics from the 60s to now, hardly anything has improved in terms of usual socioeconomic and demographic metrics. And he dropped the report from the ARC in there saying this should be mandatory reading for all who come here.
Thanks for that great question, which I could expect a great question from Ani. He's my hero and data guru and man who knows much. We're stuck in the same syndrome. I mean, this same problem of not people needing to share with each other to solve this problem. The truth of the matter is, in Appalachia, we are much more dependent on other people's money than most other communities. I mean, we have that in common probably with inner city areas, but for the rest of the state, I mean, we get back already 3, 4, 5, even more times more in tax money than we pay. We're already dependent on other people from around the state and around the country for that help. And yet I can assure you that, in our communities, we haven't accepted that very well. And I think to a certain extent, we have so shamed poor people in this country. We have so much made this a matter of being a failure of character that poor communities made up of poor people end up absorbing those same kind of values about themselves. And I think that's that's where part of the challenge we face is, you'll notice, I mean, even within our region down here, we don't have a lot of folks, legislators in this region who are real big on expanding social programs or raising taxes on rich people or doing those kind of things. Folks in our communities, I think they suffer from this being uncomfortable about asking for the help that we all need and deserve, because we do so much for the rest of the world too. I mean, our people go on, our students down here go on. We provided the energy for the whole, industrial expansion of the society. We've done so much that we've done lumber. We can go on and on about all the things that we provided, but the bottom line is everyone deserves help. And we have to start believing that about ourselves first.
Can I throw one out for you? First, thanks as always for yourself and all the work you've done and continue to do. So I know I've heard from you the concept of, poverty tourism as, obviously problematic, but when people are so divided by the many ways that we divide our poor people from our community, how do we bring their story to light in a way that's not exploitive, that does call attention to what people are suffering with, that can influence the people that make decisions to make things better?
I think that it's, we need to work with the press and the media, like I've done for years, and encourage them to tell the stories of people down here. And wherever possible, we need to let people tell their own stories. I as Ms. mentioned, I tend to get in the news quite a bit, and I have. And part of the reason that I've been successful at that is that I treat news reporters just like I did my customers back in the grocery store. I mean, when they're standing in front of me, my job is to help them, find out what they need, do what I can do to help them do their job, and treat them with respect, show an interest in them personally, do all those kind of things. But when you can't do that, the other thing they really want to do is they want to talk to real people. They want to go out and talk to poor people. They want to know real situations. They want you to tell them the facts. They want you to tell them the story behind the policy and all those things, but they want to talk to real people. So I think that's always been part of the challenge we have down. One of the things I did when I was the county director is we used to circulate these little half-page sheets to our welfare clients, because in spite of the fact that we asked them 700 questions, we never really asked them, what do you need? So we would circulate this little question and say, what would you do if you had an extra $100? What do you need? What are the issues that challenge you? We collected thousands of those over the years. But at the bottom of it, we put a little line that said, these are all anonymous. If you want to put your name on here, you can. And also, if you would be willing to talk to legislators or the press, check this little box and give us your contact information. We had thousands of those. So whenever I had a newspaper reporter call me and say, we want to do a story about grandparents taking care of kids, I had a whole list of names of people who already agreed to do that. When we wanted to talk to someone who had disabled kids, we had a list of names of people to do that. We knew that was important to the media, which is why to this day, folks still call me. It's much harder for me to do that now, to tell you the truth. But that's what they want. That's what they need. They need to tell those stories. We have to keep doing that, and we have to make sure that these people are telling their own story, that we're not telling the story for them. Just to keep reminding folks that these are human beings with needs. If there's a better way to approach this, I don't know what it is. But I do think that's important, that we make sure that real people are up front.
Thanks, Jack. Speaking of people telling their stories, Sam Smith has dropped in the chat here, wanting to know, one second, just got bumped out because of Ani, sorry. So Sam had asked, your talk has been great. Continuing the discussion, I'm curious to hear your take on hillbilly elegy and the general proliferation of works we've seen on Appalachian poverty in recent years.
Yeah, I thought hillbilly elegy was, we get distorted views about Appalachia sometimes because of the limited number of folks who are writing about it, who are from here. There's a wealth of books about Appalachia from Appalachians, but most of them don't tend to get broad dispersion throughout the whole country. They tend to be in-house kind of things. I think there's no doubt that J.D. Vance was a very smart person. He wrote a story about his experience as a poor person, which, just like I'm just saying, you let people tell their own story. I think that's valid. I think, though, that people shouldn't presume that just because you are poor or from Appalachia, that necessarily means that you also have the best idea of what the best policies are. If you understand the depth of the problem, what's behind the problems that your family and your community has faced. Just because you're a good writer, just because you are able to describe your circumstances does not mean that you have that kind of insight. And that's the way I would kind of describe that book. I don't think that he had a very good insight into the issues behind that, which doesn't mean that, that weren't real experiences he faced, real things that happened. They were, but I'm not so sure that he would necessarily have the insight into what was behind those things. I think it's a difficult situation when, and I know there's a lot of pushback when for instance, the AP came down here and did a big story about Appalachia, which a lot of people thought was, not particularly flattering. I think there's some folks who even were upset about the show that the Frontline folks recently did. I was involved with numerous programs, national programs, that kind of showed, the poverty down here. It's a tough call because on one hand, if we expect the rest of the country, the rest of the state, the rest of society to continue to give us money, to send money down here, we can't necessarily just show this rosy picture to them of how wonderful and great things are down here and expect that somehow they're going to say, well, that's great. Therefore, we need an Appalachian Regional Commission. Therefore, we need, these subsidies for poor people. We need all those things, these environmental programs. They have to understand how serious the problem is. And often that is uncomfortable for us to put that foot forward, to show people, how bad the environmental challenges are here, how bad the jobs are, all the things that we struggle with down here. If we expect these other people to help us, then we have to accept that we have to show people how bad it is. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I think it did. Thank you. I don't see anyone with their hand raised or anything else in the chat. So I'm just going to ask a personal question. So living in Nelsonville, I see this on a daily basis, and there are a lot of great resources. We have this woman in town. She's an absolute angel named Dottie, and she has put together this Nelsonville community dinner, and they feed like 300 people every Thursday. And so there's great internal resources, because of what I struggle with is, I'm privileged and I do have somewhat of a voice, but I can't get up to these higher powers and make sure that they are, allocating funding in the budget to welfare and so on. So what would you recommend just anyone in this room do in their communities to help when they see this? It's frustrating for me seeing, thank goodness we do have public transit in Nelsonville now. And so folks can get to Athens to work. They can get to Athens to, get resources that we don't have here. But for example, if we don't have a clothing store, we need a Goodwill. There's so many needs that are not met. What would you recommend, anyone in this room to do to advocate for those, or to volunteer to improve people's lives?
Actually, Mackenzie, I think you put your finger right on the heart of it. And I kind of feel bad when you said, you didn't feel like you were in a position where you could speak out on this. Actually, you and everyone else here is in the perfect position to speak out on all of this. It's exactly from all of you folks that legislators need to hear that, that you're not going to have a fit if all of a sudden we give people enough food to to eat and put a roof over their head, that you actually think that's a good idea, that you support these kind of things. That's the only way these things have ever changed, is groundswells of people, whole communities, people reaching out saying, it's okay. We want to share with these folks. I think that, when you look at Nelsonville in particular, any small community like that, things like so many people there are dependent on public assistance, raising public SSI payments, raising Social Security payments, raising food stamps, raising those things would bring literally, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars into those communities. Housing, public housing funds, all kind of things like that. All of those kind of things are things that we need, just like we need the water system in Nelsonville. It's a very difficult time functioning. And they had, last time I checked, they had like 100 and some people cut off because they couldn't afford their water bills. Well, at the same time, the water system up there, has massive leaks, has equipment they can't install because they can't afford it, because people can't afford to pay decent water bills. So, having the fact that that system needs the EPA to put a ton of money into the water system up there so that they can fix the water system without charging exorbitant water rates, so that, we offer assistance to people so they can afford to pay a water bill. All of those kind of things. I mean, we're going to have to get money in here from other communities and other people, but that fixes and makes life better for people in Nelsonville. So we can't be afraid to ask for that, for what we really need.
Thanks, Jack. Does anyone else have any questions? I realize we have just a couple more minutes before we hit 1 o'clock.
Just to say thank you, Jack, too, for your presentation today, and that our team, our GIS team and folks at the Voinovich School are continuing to work on meeting with county commissioners and each of the counties across the Appalachian Basin, municipalities, to gather that information about the water systems that are struggling and where people have no access to public water. And then that issue keeps coming back up in each of the counties. Even when there are water lines, there are still people who can't afford to have that tap, turned on, or to even buy into that tap. So there's something that it's, as we've worked across these counties now, each one of them has expressed, that need in their local communities for that water infrastructure. So we're keeping our eye on, the governor's House Bill 110 and see if that water infrastructure amount comes through, because that's definitely going to help with some of those situations.
There are so many people here at the Voinovich School who are doing great things that are helping poor people. And certainly, Jen, the stuff you were working on, and I know Annie's research and, a lot of stuff Leslie's folks are doing. I mean, there's just so many people here that are doing great things that are making a difference right now. And I think that's something we need to, Mackenzie, that's something we just need to make sure we keep telling that story.
I agree. Well, thank you, Jack. I really appreciate you, sharing your insights from your career and continuing to advocate and empowering all of us to do the same. I do want to remind those of you left on the call, we do have a session coming up on March 17th. It will be with the executive director of the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy district. His name is Craig Butler. Some of you might know him or work with him already. And again, thank you, Jack. We really appreciate you taking the time for the conversation today. I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.